you ever heard someone say that Cymru can't go it alone because of its deficit? You may have heard phrases like, England subsidises your country, or you're too poor, or we're all better off together. To the people who make those statements, the obvious question is, why don't you let us go if we're such a drain? You never come up with a good enough answer though. However, a recent report by Professor John Doyle from the Dublin City University casts serious doubt on some of these statements made about Cymru. The fact that the data he's used comes directly from the ONS, who report to the UK Parliament, makes these assertions really hard to argue against. Before we delve any deeper, here are some definitions that you need to be aware of. Revenue. This is the catch-all term for money that comes into the government via taxes. Expenditure. This is the amount of money that a government spends. Budget. This is the general term for a government's overall financial statement. Surplus. Budget is in surplus when revenues are more than expenditure. Deficit. Consequently, if expenditure is higher than revenue, the budget is in deficit. A government then needs to make up for this, either by borrowing, cutting public services, or making up for it some other way. Now, all the figures in this video come from the Office for National Statistics. This is a public body, and they're all freely available for anyone to have a look at. The ONS are the executive office of the UK Statistics Authority, and they report directly to the UK Parliament. So, these are the figures from the Office for National Statistics. On the left here, you've got the revenue, and on the right here, you've got the expenditure. So all of these numbers come from the UK Statistics Authority, who report to the UK Parliament. So we know that these figures are the ones that everyone's using. So all of the numbers are also in millions. We don't raise £26,901 of tax in Wales, 26 billion tax in Wales. Okay, so we've got the taxes and revenues. This accounting, and you'll also see it on the right hand side here, what this means is basically money that is tangled up so much in the Office for National Statistics and in the UK Treasury that we don't know exactly what it's paying for. They don't keep very good records specifically to Wales, so unfortunately those two numbers have got to stay in there because we know that that's what's spent, but we don't actually know what it's spent on. So if we've got the taxes and revenues of 26.9 billion and we've got the accounting of 2.6 billion, what that means is the total amount of money that comes into Wales according to the national statistics is 29 billion 532 million. In terms of expenditure, this is all the things that comes out of Welsh Government pocket or the UK Government pocket on behalf of Wales. So each of these OBOs, that stands for on behalf of. Okay, so state pensions. Just in 2019 alone, the amount of money that was paid out by the government to Welsh citizens was £5.9 billion in pensions. Okay, just state pensions. That's your national insurance contributions, those sorts of pensions. State employed pensions, so that's pensions for NHS workers or police or firefighters, that is totals at £3.2 billion. Now these next three are amounts of money that the UK government pays on behalf of Wales, as you can see there clearly. So in terms of Wales's payment of the UK debt on behalf of Wales, the money that the Office for National Statistics comes up with for that is nearly £2.7 billion. UK overseas expenditure, so for embassies, for staff, for consulates and things like that, and also for foreign aid, and also for the money for the withdrawal agreement as well. That is just over £1.2 billion on behalf of Wales. And then for defence, for the UK defence, Wales's defence is obviously not devolved, so they pay on behalf of Wales £1.9 billion. This other identified figure of 24.4 nearly billion pounds is money that has already been identified. We know what that's for. That's for hospitals, that's for police, that is for teachers, you know, that's their wages, that's for state sector workers, and money that has been identified. And here there's this accounting which is kind of unidentified, so we don't really know what that does. And it's the same as the one over here, but we know that it's an amount of money that comes out, and the ONS still record it. So the total for this is a whopping 42,994,000,000. So nearly 43 billion. That means that the deficit, because it is a deficit, because the expenditure is higher than the revenue, the deficit with a big old minus is £13.462 billion. There you go. So this is where the ONS, unionists, and everybody really, until this report came out, gets the figure of £13.5 billion deficit for Wales. Just to give you an idea, that's the equivalent of 17% of our GDP. That is a huge amount. To put that into perspective, Afghanistan in 2017, their deficit to GDP ratio was 15.1. So with this number, it's not looking too good. If these figures are to be believed, it paints a terrible picture for the argument for an independent Wales. However, this is where the report by Professor John Doyle of Dublin City University steps in and sheds light on what these numbers actually mean to an independent Wales.
Firstly, and most importantly, pensions. State pensions are paid out of everyone's national insurance contributions, and the money for this goes to the UK Treasury. It always has done. Say you worked your whole life in the UK as it stands, but decided to retire to Ireland or Spain or France. The UK Treasury would continue to pay your state pension, not Ireland or Spain or France. These arrangements already exist. So pensions to anyone living in an independent Cymru would still be paid for by the UK Treasury. Now obviously this wouldn't last forever, but after independence, Cymru could have its own pensions and national insurance style contribution policy. It would build up its pension account for people who work there and pay out to them wherever they retire. Say you worked half your life in Wales as part of the Union and the other half in an independent Cymru. You'd receive half your state pension from the Westminster Treasury when you retire and half from the Welsh Treasury. The UK and the Republic of Ireland signed an agreement just like this in 2019.
So what does this mean for the budget of an independent Wales? Well, what this means is that state pensions can come out of the budget because Wales won't be paying them straight away in the first instance. So if we get rid of that, that's 5.9 billion better off already. So now our total outgoings are 37 billion and 88 million, giving us a deficit, still a deficit of 7.556 billion pounds. Secondly, let's focus on the spending that the UK government does on behalf of Wales. So here, that's the debt, the overseas expenditure, and defence.
In an independent Cymru, policy on defence and overseas spending would be agreed upon in the Senedd not decided on Wales's behalf at Westminster. Now the £1.9 billion that Westminster pays on Wales's behalf is 2.5% of Wales's GDP, nearly twice the average value of the whole of the EU defence spending combined. Professor John Doyle suggests that spending 1.3% of GDP on defence to bring Cymru in line with the EU would save £922 million a year. Similarly, overseas spending would be decided at the Senedd, not by Westminster. Wales may not want to have as many consulates, embassies and staff working in all the countries that the UK does. Those offices would all be far smaller in size too. Professor Doyle scales this figure with defence spending, halving it, saving £620 million. As for UK debt repayments, some commentators suggest that an independent Wales should take on its share of the UK debt proportional to its population. But this means Wales would be entitled to the same percentage of the UK's worldwide assets. An independent Cymru would own around 5% of all of it, if they were to take on 5% of the UK debt. It doesn't matter if it's embassies in the United States, the United Nations Security Council seat, or the Palace of Westminster itself. If England wanted to sell, demolish, or renovate anything in England or any other UK assets, they would have to ask permission from an independent Welsh government because Wales would own 5% of that asset. I doubt England would like to have to do that. So, in return for not taking on the debt, Wales would relinquish their right to a percentage of the assets owned by the rest of the UK. This seems fair.
Now, suppose that this can be negotiated and agreed upon by both parties. That would take away the debt contribution from an independent Wales. So that goes completely. Now, I've already changed the overseas expenditure to 620 million, as mentioned, and I've changed the defence to 980 million, as also talked about. So, what this number brings us to is 32,874 million. And it leaves us with a deficit now of 3.342 billion pounds. We're getting there.
Finally, on taxes, Professor Doyle also assessed the accuracy of the ONS figures for Wales's tax revenues. It is difficult to determine given the centralised nature of the UK government's finances, but a recent assessment of the Northern Irish finances showed that its share of corporation tax and capital gains tax revenue, otherwise known as gross operating surplus or GOS, closely matched its GDP percentage relative to the UK. The Office for National Statistics says Wales generates 1.8% of all of the UK's capital gains tax and 2.5% of the corporation tax revenues, yet Cymru's GDP is 3.5% of the UK's GDP. While it is an educated estimation, this adjustment in tax revenue adds 735 million to Cymru's tax revenues. Not insignificant.
So, combining all of these changes made by Professor Doyle, Cymru's deficit is now down to £2.6 billion. That's 3.4% of Wales's GDP. That's the same GDP deficit ratio as the United States in 2017. And they're not exactly a developing economy, are they? These findings are monumental for the debate around independence in Cymru. Adam Price, the Senedd leader of Plaid Cymru, called them game-changing. Andrew R.T. Davies, leader of the Welsh Conservatives, took a different approach, called them back-of-an-envelope, fantasy figures. Now, true to form, he hasn't provided any evidence to the contrary that any of these figures are wrong, that the ONS is wrong, that the UK Parliament Statistics Agency is wrong. And considering some of his other remarks, you might think that the leader of the Welsh Conservatives hasn't read the report at all, or he doesn't even understand it. Maybe he could have a watch of this video. Maybe you'd learn a thing or two, Andrew. So here's where I want to take this further. If you can see here, our deficit was here when we started this exercise, 13.4 billion. And now we're down to 2.6 billion. Much more manageable. But there's something that really stands out here, and it's this state employed pensions. Now, Professor John Doyle talks about this in his report, but he doesn't include it in the final calculations. The money for state employed pensions goes to the same place that state pensions do. So teacher pensions, police pensions, those kind of pensions all end up in the UK Treasury anyway. Wales doesn't have its own specific treasury holding all of this pension money, holding all of those pension accounts. So if it goes to the same place, the UK Treasury, then I feel that this number can be treated exactly the same as this number, which means in the first instance of an independent Wales wouldn't be paying that. It would still come from the UK Treasury. Therefore, it can be got rid of. And if we get rid of that, and this number comes down by 3.2 billion, this number goes up by 3.2 billion. So in the end, what we're dealing with here, Wales could actually run a surplus. If this is all applicable, and we can get rid of state pensions, state employed pensions, debt, decrease the overseas funding, because that would be Wales's policy, decrease the defence funding, because that would also be Wales's policy, keeping these two the same, so providing the same standard and the same public services that Wales does already, without any other kind of policy changes, the total outgoings becomes 29,674,000,000. Now, what's happened is the revenue is more than the expenditure. So the deficit is not a deficit anymore. In fact, it's a surplus. And that surplus, by my calculations anyway, is 593 million. So there we have it. The ONS figure of £13.5 billion for a Welsh deficit is categorically wrong. An independent Wales could even run a surplus. The idea of some prohibitive deficit is total nonsense. And subsequently, anyone who tries to make the statements that I talked about at the beginning, they're going to have these facts to contend with. If, like Andrew R.T. Davis, you believe that these figures are back of an envelope or fantasy in some way, in a way, you're right. But that's not the fault of anyone on the independent side of the debate. That's the fault of the ONS and the UK Parliament for not keeping good enough records of what happens in Wales separate to what happens in the rest of the UK. The solution to that is for the ONS and the UK Parliament to get their affairs in order. Perhaps they can come back with some fresh figures, some better evidence, or just data that actually is up to date and accurate for Wales. The fact that this doesn't happen really shows that we're not in a union of equals. Either way, Professor John Doyle has shown that Wales can stand on its own 2 feet economically. The ONS figures show that the reason for Wales's deficit is because of the union. Besides the economy, there's a democratic and a political cost to Wales being in the union as well. Democratically, Wales has never voted Tory since 1885. And yet, more often than not, we're ruled by Tory governments. Politically, Wales has always been the lowest priority at Westminster. Look at Aberfan, look at the coal tips that are still there, look at Capel Celyn. They'd rather drown places in Wales so that England can prosper.
Wales deserves to be an independent nation, and now we know that we could afford it. To finish off, I'd like to quote a well-known Tory MP, Michael Gove of all people. When he was asked, "Do you think Wales could thrive as a self-governing nation?" he said, "Wales is an amazing place." And absolutely, of course it could. Not only could it, I believe it should.